So with the fourth video, we're going to go at putting demand and supply together. This is really the centerpiece of the course. Everything that comes later, monopoly, perfect competition, factor markets, all are built off of this simple supply and demand model, which is why all year I've been talking about how it is perfection, it is the ideal, it is what we're always striving to receive. So let's say we're drawing the market for something simple. Let's call it hot dogs. Right, we're always going to get that free point on the FRQs by labeling the horizontal and vertical axes. And now we can think about, well, what do we see when we combine a downward sloping demand curve and an upward sloping supply curve? Because of the alternate natures of the law of demand and the law of supply, you're always going to have just one equilibrium point. And this becomes, we'll call it Q1 and P1. This becomes the equilibrium point. And when a market reaches equilibrium, it doesn't want to move. It wants to stay there as long as it possibly can. It takes something other than a change in price to knock the market out of equilibrium. A couple other things to remember about equilibrium. Above the price and below the demand curve, this triangle is your consumer surplus. Below the price, above the supply curve, is your producer surplus. And when we're at equilibrium, there's no deadweight loss, consumer and producer surplus are maximized, and we're as efficient as we possibly can be. Now, going back to this concept of supply and demand shifts, well, what happens if something external to the price impacts the market? So let's say the cost of hot dog buns goes up. How will that affect supply or demand? Well, it's going to affect demand because hot dogs and hot dog buns are complements. You use them together. So if the price of buns goes up, my demand for hot dogs is going to go down. So I'm going to see a shift, and notice I'm going to label the original demand curve 1. We're going to see a shift to the left, or a decrease in demand, to demand curve 2. And that brings us to a new quantity. Notice it's lower because we have a lower demand for it and a lower price at the new equilibrium. Because if sellers still want to sell hot dogs because demand is lower, what do they need to do with the price? They need to lower it. Now, we can also shift supply. And what happens if shifts happen at the same time? So let's say there's an increase in technology used to make the hot dogs, and it makes it easier to make hot dogs. So what's going to happen to supply? Well, that's going to move supply to the right. Supply 2. And a couple things to notice out of here. Right? For sure, price has gone down continually. Both of these shifts from our original equilibrium, we'll call it A to B to C, both of these shifts have brought price down. But if we think about what has happened to quantity, when the demand shift happened, quantity went left, decreased. But when the supply shift happened, quantity moves to the right and increases. And since we're working without numbers, what can we say about what happened to quantity? Well, we can't say anything. We say that quantity here is ambiguous. Price is definitely down as a result of this double shift, but quantity is ambiguous. We don't know for certain what has happened to quantity. And that's something they're going to ask on multiple choice and maybe even the FRQ of the AP exam. Now, a couple other quick things to note when we're talking about market equilibriums. You're going to be asked questions about price floors, price ceilings, and quotas. All three of them are ways that the government can influence the market. So if we talk about ceilings, we just got a normal demand and supply curve, and we are at equilibrium. Why would we put a price ceiling below equilibrium? Well, the purpose of the price ceiling is to keep price from rising, to keep price from going up. Right? We want to prevent price from going up. Well, who does that benefit? It benefits the consumers, right? Because they like low prices. Who does it hurt? It hurts the producers. So at the price ceiling, the quantity that's demanded is much higher than equilibrium. But the quantity that is supplied is lower, because why would a producer want to supply something when they have to supply it at a lower price? So that leads to a bunch of things, black markets, but most importantly for our case, it leads to a, you got it, deadweight loss. Right? Deadweight loss is always going to be a triangle from the quantity you're at pointing back towards the original equilibrium point. Same is true of floors and quotas, that they're going to create inefficiencies that lead to deadweight losses. So always be labeling, and now we've got demand, supply, original equilibrium. A floor you put above equilibrium to keep prices high, to keep them from falling. And who likes that? Who likes high prices? Well, suppliers. And that's why the best example of a price floor is a minimum wage. It helps protect the suppliers of labor. Who doesn't like it? Well, in this case, it's the consumers of labor don't like it, so the quantity demanded goes down. Again, creating for us a deadweight loss pointing back at the original equilibrium. Now, what does a quota do? Well, a quota doesn't restrict price, it restricts quantity, and the purpose of a quota in most cases is to do some sort of environmental protection or traffic reduction, saying that at equilibrium, the quantity at equilibrium is too high. The quantity equilibrium is too much for society. So we put in a quota to the left of equilibrium. It has to go to the left because we're trying to reduce the amount being produced. And that leads to a difference between the price the buyers pay and the price the sellers expect. And we remember, we called the difference between those two the quota rent, and that becomes the license fee. In most cases, the license fee. But again, there leads into having a deadweight loss in society because we're not at equilibrium. So the big takeaway is, whenever you're trying to find efficiency, you're always driving for equilibrium. And anytime you're not at the equilibrium quantity, you're going to have some sort of inefficiency and deadweight loss. Now, we might want that, as in the case of a minimum wage, but the test is going to ask you to be able to acknowledge that there is some inefficiency in the market.